Greetings from George Brown College in Toronto, Canada. My name is Dr. Chris McGrath, and I am so thrilled to be joining you all today by video. Video because it's Convocation Week here at George Brown, and I unfortunately am unable to join you in Cork, and I hope that you're having a wonderful gathering. I'm going to share with you some of my research around frame-bending quality in post-secondary education as a means to advance equity and student success. Now, specifically looking at the Ontario college system, it was established in 1967. And the college system in Ontario is established under one act of government. One set of legislation covers 24 publicly assisted colleges. Unlike the universities in the province, where the universities each have their own act of government, the colleges have a singular act of government and therefore function as crown agencies. We function as government agencies and corporations. To that end, the association with government and accountability for key performance indicators, which often reflect governmental priorities, that is a much tighter relationship in the Ontario college system than it is, in fact, in the university space. And so colleges can be expected often to be very quickly and immediately and nimbly responsive to emerging priorities. We've seen that in the past 2 years as colleges across the province were part of a coordinated effort to, in fact, increase the number of students graduating from nursing programs and personal support worker programs as part of the province's response to the global COVID-19 pandemic. That said, quality as an expression of how we're doing in post-secondary, particularly in colleges, has, I would argue, a heavier sense of accountability and alignment towards government priorities for the college system. And for many years, for the past 7 or 8 years, in fact, key performance indicators of accountability and also performance they've remained relatively stable across 24 colleges. And those key performance indicators, if there were improvements on them, there was a modest financial reward to colleges for exceeding perhaps the provincial average or other sorts of benchmarks. Now, with reliance on revenues from student tuition, ancillary fees, and other fees supporting roughly 65% of annual college budgets, really meeting these benchmarks and these indicators is critically important. But in 2018, the provincial funding model for post-secondary education changed to a performance-based model. And now every organization, every college has a strategic mandate agreement. And in that mandate agreement, we have agreed to self-identified performance metrics and targets that if we hit them, we will garner a percentage of our annual operating grant. So historically, our budget was driven by and derived by enrollment, the number of students in a given number of seats on a given academic year, and is now really heavily swinging towards the outcomes of post-secondary education. Now, arguably, these outcomes are really broadly economically instrumental. And to be honest, that's not surprising given the fact that colleges really are corporations of the province. And the colleges were founded, to be quite frank, in the late 1960s to really help Ontarians, people of Ontario, get the education they need to find employment, to improve the economy and boost industry. That said, the emphasis away from KPIs as sort of operating indicators and more towards performance-based funding as outcome indicators has really shifted how we think about quality in the province. And those external drivers have been around trying to diversify funding externally with government and policy shifts, and also some internal drivers towards that type of a change where organizations like my own can shift how we think about performance-based outcomes and quality. Those include perhaps commitments to new strategic plans and commitments to advancing access and equity. Broadly speaking, at the same time that this shift in government policy was occurring, college leaders find themselves called to task, in some ways with a little bit of a crisis of conscience. Not only has the global pandemic dramatically impacted how we think about the quality of our educational and co-curricular programming, but also burgeoning social movements, such as those around anti-Black racism, around decolonization and indigeneity here in Canada, as well as any other sort of geopolitical crisis that has prompted, I think, a more punctuated degree of activism from the public towards post-secondary, has really underscored the role that we play in the public good. And so what quality then means for our public may not necessarily be in line with what it means to government. So we have these strategic agreements which really tie us to economic outcomes, such as graduation rates, employment rates of our graduates, the starting salary of our graduates, the economic impact of student enrollment in your given community. And yet I believe that by virtue of a lot of these burgeoning social movements, there's an expectation from the public that quality means something different. And quality, by virtue of the barriers that have surfaced in the past 2.5 years of the pandemic, really has a strong emphasis around equity and access to student success. And so what that then does is it calls upon colleges and universities to contemplate their role, not only as agents of the government, and in our case as a college, but also as agents and guardians in some ways of the public and social good. And so it calls upon us to contemplate a different type of organizational and individual leadership within our space. And I argue that social justice leadership, broadly speaking, as framed by Rotman, Cindy Rotman, really captures opportunities for organizations at several levels, at the discursive level within how we talk about quality, within the group level of how colleges are organized, and within the individual level about how leaders in fact enact with both the group and the discourse, that using a social justice framework that really moves across critical traditions like feminism, like anti-racism, like decolonization, that this is an umbrella approach that helps leaders, particularly with those of us with broad influence as scholars, educators, and also administrative leaders, to focus beyond what is really one axis of disadvantage and create a rallying point for change to reduce barriers to access and to widen inclusion to to post-secondary education. And so the approach of social justice is more broad in far-reaching, that it's not restricted to one critical paradigm, but rather challenges ideas and ideologies of leadership, power, and freedom within our institutions. And so within Rotman's model, as I said, leadership can be expressed at the discursive level in terms of what quality represents. And we've seen that in terms of the tension between government policy and what the public expects. It can be exercised, leadership, moral leadership can be exercised at the group level when colleges consider, well, what is our role in the public good? And what is our obligation to the public good? And then at the individual level, in fact, social justice leadership can be exercised by individual leaders or groups of individual leaders who work within their organizations, who understand and envision an opportunity to change and perhaps move very slowly and slightly and nimbly and quietly to impact and affect change within their organizations. And my doctoral work argues, in fact, that tempered radicalism, which is a type of leadership that was researched by Deborah Meyerson, really uses the idea of an insider-outsider, uses the idea that individuals within post-secondary educations who have experiences of being marginalized, experiences of oppression, and experiences being parts of equity-seeking communities can in fact leverage that sense of self to advocate for and activate social change within their organizations. The work that I have done around quality then argues that colleges can in fact, as organizational actors, act as tempered radicals within the overall post-secondary space. And the ways that tempered radicalism takes shape is that it can sort of be a quiet and maybe a little bit more of a subversive approach to motivating change, such that leaders and collections of leaders can turn threats into opportunities. They can sort of resist quietly and push back on the status quo and really not adopt an activist standpoint in terms of calling for flat out transformation, but eventually sort of just reposition and reorient how an organization thinks about quality. And as such, Nadler and Tushman would describe this as organizational frame bending. So we're not talking about a reframe of quality. We're not talking about breaking up the idea of quality. We're talking about bending the frame ever so slightly over time so that it fits a new picture of what in fact quality looks like and what quality means. And so tempered radicalism and frame bending is a very slight, very quiet, very humble approach to leadership and to change. And it requires that through incremental semi-strategic reforms, and sometimes through very spontaneous and unremarkable expressions of change, that in fact organizations can change. And so the work that I have undertaken really argues that by virtue of mobilizing a group of tempered radicals within an organization, a group of educators who perhaps have that insider-outsider perspective that can be derived from identity with an equity-seeking group or an allyship with an equity-seeking group, that they in fact can begin to push back against the economic instrumentality of our funding outcomes and our government outcomes, and contemplate how do we bend the frame of that idea of what economic outcomes represent, what graduate earnings represents, and how do we trace back, how do we thread back what that means for racialized students, what that means for students who experience disabilities. And so very sort of quietly and nimbly sequencing how we think about quality and positioning our organizations, both through services, programs, places, and policies, to really motivate change, to reduce barriers, is a way that leaders can exercise tempered radicalism and in fact bend the frame of quality. And Nadler and Tushman propose that it's a very straightforward process of initiating a case for change, establishing content, leading the change, and achieving that change. But that change has to be achieved with conspirators, with collaborators, with other tempered radicals who from the inside see a need and an opportunity for transformation to happen, but not in a manner that's going to completely disrupt the day-to-day workings of the organization. All that said, there are really some lingering questions that relate to this type of approach to change, specifically when it comes to reducing barriers to access and inclusion. So as insider-outsiders, as leaders, as student affairs and student success practitioners, how do change processes engage individuals whose lives such frameworks seek to improve? So how do we engage people from the equity-seeking communities to ensure that the types of change we're advocating for are authentic and relevant and linked to their real experience? How does data from different sources and methodologies and different knowledge traditions get integrated in how we think about change? So how are we decolonizing the knowledge base that motivates how we measure and how we output quality? How can the processes of change, in fact, be less colonial? How can the processes of change, in fact, perhaps garner more collective efforts as opposed to hierarchical powers expressed through organizations and structures and traditional constructs of leadership? And also, in so doing, how does a change process, particularly one around quality, equity, and access, ensure that it doesn't reinforce that leader-follower paradigm that is often replicated through the dominant cultures of organizations where white, cisgendered men tend to hold those spaces of power. So looking at change in this way at the individual and at the organizational level requires that we exercise a very strong ethic of care to engage constituent stakeholders, mostly students and other educators from equity-deserving populations, to ensure that how we think about quality is authentic, it's relevant, and it's connected to the true everyday experiences of those communities for whom we wish to widen access and make sure that there's greater inclusion. I'm happy to be with you, albeit briefly today, and would welcome any opportunity to discuss this work further with you as colleagues from around the world. I wish you a very successful remainder of the conference.